Hi everybody, I'm Sue Clarke, Detective Chief Superintendent with Lancashire Police. Currently I've got the great job of being the head of the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network. And I'm going to introduce now Niven to let him introduce himself, and then we're going to introduce a topic that we think people will be interested in speaking about and hearing about.
Hi, thanks, Sue. I'm Niven Rennie. I'm the Director of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. I was 31 years in the police, retired in 2016, and I've been doing this job for 2.5 years, having spent 2 years in the third sector working with a homeless charity in between.
Thanks, Niven. So I think if we just put everybody in the picture, this conversation's come about because 2 or 3 weeks ago, some colleagues of mine put on some images on Twitter, and those images were of some knives that have been recovered in Preston, actually, in Preston city centre. And that sparked a bit of a contact between us two around how appropriate or otherwise those images were. So is that okay with you if I just kind of go into that a little bit and then
Sure. Yeah, you lead on.
So I suppose from my perspective on this is, I think underneath it pretty similar to you, but I wanted to explore this really in terms of the sort of Twitter community and wider, because the media do like to put these pictures of knives on the media. And also from a police perspective, I think sometimes there's a bit of, they think they're doing it to reassure the public that they're doing their job, and that, look, we've made the streets safer because we've recovered these weapons. And our officers probably think they're doing the right thing as well, because they think the bosses have tasked me to do this search of an area, whatever it happens to be, and look what I found, and haven't I done well? So I know that the Scottish VRU's got quite quite clear views on this, and I don't know if everybody Twitter-wise or wider than that knows about the kind of philosophy that you guys promulgate. So it was just to kind of bring you in, Niven, and say from a Glasgow perspective, what's the view on the portrayal of images, whether it's on social media or in the media in general?
Well, I first of all, I'm sympathetic to the view that you just expressed. I think a lot of police organisations, police forces, police officers at all levels feel a responsibility for violence, and that public reassurance bit is something that I've seen throughout my career, and I hear of a lot. And also there's other bit, having been a young police officer at one point in the dim and distant past, when you come across a big threatening knife and you're seizing it, you're quite shaken, and you want to say to folk, look what I took off the street tonight. But the converse argument to that is it really reassuring for the public? Because the young people that we've been working with for 15 years tell us that actually most of them carry knives because they think everybody else is. So you're creating a climate of fear where people feel they've got to carry a knife. How many times have we heard it? For our own protection. So that is one element of it. The second element of it is it actually distorts the picture of reality, because, and I 31 years in the police, various levels up to senior management, I have a really good understanding of this, and I feel really sympathetic. But to be honest, you don't pick up these things every night. Maybe somebody does, but to keep posting them night after night after night distorts the reality of what the police are facing every day. So I'm just wondering whether it gives an accurate picture, but is it really worth taking that risk that you're going to put it onto social media and say to people, here's what other people are carrying in the street? As one of my colleagues said in response to that conversation that you and I had, which was really quite interesting, a former gang member, his view was, well, if that's the biggest knife people are carrying, I've got to carry a bigger one. So you're actually just creating a problem further down the line.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I'm aware that there's some studies going on. I think South Yorkshire, Sheffield, Hallam have just started the study, and I think you said that Glasgow, I don't know if it's Stirling or you want the uni up there anyway, just started a study on this, haven't they, to try and improve the evidence base around it.
Yeah, there isn't really an evidence base, and you know, it's an understanding of the problem and understanding, speaking to people. That's what it's based on. And you know, I feel sorry for Preston because we quoted them because of their knife picture. But this happens all the time. It really happens down in London. You get an awful lot from the Metropolitan Task Force, and I challenge it all the time, and I get pushback. You know, and the pushback is, well, show me the empirical study that says this is wrong. So there isn't any. So what we've done is we've commissioned Glasgow University to go and have a look at it, and they started to work with Strathclyde University to come up with a study into this. And as you say, Sheffield are doing it as well. And it's about time we had something to look at, because it's not just Twitter, you know. It's media in general. I keep saying to journalists, I get interviewed by the Mail on Sunday from Dublin last week, and my plea was, when you put this story up, don't put a picture of a knife on it, please, you know, because that's what you feel as a sub-editor doing pictures. Here's a story about violence and what they call knife crime, but I don't use that term. It's just violence to me. A knife's a weapon. And what they do is, we've got this story, we've got to put a picture of a knife dripping with blood or behind somebody's back, and actually it's just amplifying the problem. We should be more positive than that.
Definitely.
And so it's not just Twitter.
No, I mean, to reinforce what you're saying, we did some market research across Lancashire last year, about 1,500 young people, which probably could contribute on, I mean, thought about it, towards this evidence. And 2% of them said they carried a knife, but 42% of them thought that other people carried a knife. Now, you might think they're never going to tell the police that they carry a knife, but a lot of it was anonymous, the survey anyway. And our knife crime is only 1% of our serious violence in Lancashire. But you know, this is why I kind of was itching to get this conversation going with you, because I think your experience shows people that's the reality, that other people, you think more people think other people are carrying a knife than actually they carry one themselves. And you're right, the fear that fear that evokes in them is a fear, like a fight or flight response, isn't it? Even just seeing the images.
So let's look at the reality of the situation. And you're mentioning statistics down there. So last year in Scotland there were 64 homicides. Please say 62. The government says 64. I'll go with the government figure. So 64 homicides. The average age of a perpetrator was in their 40s, and the average age of a victim was 33. So this is not a young person's offence in Scotland. Now, 55% of these homicides involved a knife or an edged weapon, but over 66% of them happened in the home.
Yeah.
And that's because we're selling our alcohol cheaply in supermarkets. So people are drinking at home and they're falling out at home. So this isn't people carrying knives around the street. This is people falling out and grabbing the nearest thing to hand, which is a kitchen knife or a screwdriver. That is a bigger problem than knife carrying in Scotland. Although we had that problem. We had more than double that 15 years ago. But what we found working with young people is they're getting drawn into street crime, they're getting drawn into violence because of the situation in which they're living. And in actual fact, and we could talk a whole program about this, it's about poverty and a reaction to poverty. So what we need to do is concentrate on the positives and give people positive opportunities and ways of getting out of the lifestyle they're living, not perpetrate that image by putting these photos up and talking about violence all the time.
And I have seen that. I don't know about Scotland, but here we've got people going into schools and colleges, some of them third sector organisations, and I've tried to give feedback to some of them around exactly this subject. But it's like totally the concept of not showing a knife in a school or a college environment to get the point across to people that, you know, that they shouldn't do it, is totally alien to most people. And I think that's because the information that we talk about all the time in the kind of VRU setting is around those underlying causes. So we're looking at the causes of violence. We're not, you know, as you say, knife's a weapon. Carrying a knife might be a symptom of other things to me. So the wider point is that this is about the underlying causes and drivers for violence, of which poverty is certainly a factor.
we don't ever claim that we've cracked it. You know, 64 homicides in Scotland last year, 64 too many. But we've come a lot. We've done 15 years of the journey, and so we've been through this dialogue, we've been through this discussion, and what we used to do for generations was, you know, you'd have knife amnesties or campaigns, police enforcement campaigns, where you seize the weapons. And we've all seen it in our own various police forces. You put a big white sheet on the ground and you put all the knives out and you photograph it, look what we seized. But actually that was counterproductive, so we stopped doing that. And I still see an element of that happening down south. And some of the things I ask makes people uncomfortable. It's designed particularly to do that. But I'm asking, you know, is there a competition? Are you trying to show that your shift sees more knives than the shift that come on after you, or that your borough has sees more knives than the neighbouring borough, or bigger knives? You know, and in actual fact, if you look at the Twitter accounts that the police are using, very often their followers are all from the police family. They're not reassuring the public in the slightest. They're just telling their colleagues what they've seized. So it does, that element of competition is something that I'm quite happy to level, because I'm not quite certain if when they come back and say it's for public reassurance, that they're putting it into the target market in any event. So my plea is just stop doing it, you know?
Yeah. And have you had this kind of conversation with sort of the sort of more mainstream media, you know, in BBC or any newspapers?
It disappoints me, but you know, I understand that the journalist you speak to is not normally responsible for A, the headline, or B, the pictures that accompany a story. That's down to sub-editing. And whilst you do a story and you make a plea to the journalist, you don't put a backdrop of a knife. I was interviewed one time live in BBC, and behind me was a backdrop of somebody carrying a knife. It was just completely, totally different messaging. But I don't know how able the journalist is to actually arrange that, but it's certainly a conversation worth having. It's you know, every time a story about a rise in knife crime or a drop in knife crime goes on the internet, it's accompanied by a picture of a knife. You know, we all know what a knife looks like. You know, do we need the picture?
Another interesting part of this conversation that you and I have discussed before is around the point that you raised earlier about household knives and the prevalence of household knives in homicides, not just in this country, I'm sure it's worldwide. I just wonder about talking about that, you know, in terms of the different shaped knives that you described, we've discussed before.
Yeah, so there's a really good guy up here, a psychiatrist, John Crichton, who is the president of the Royal Society of Psychologists in Scotland, and he's been challenging manufacturers to produce a less lethal knife, because it's not just it's in self-harm as well. So the question he's been asking is, unless you've all got the skills of Marcus Waring, do you really need a sharp knife in your kitchen? And yet you go into any household kitchen across the land and there'll be a display of them in wooden stands or in drawers. And, you know, I remember, I think I spoke to you the last time we spoke about this, not so long ago, Tesco's were handing out vouchers to get discount off a knife block and you take away these sharp knives. Now, these are the murder weapons of choice because they're in the home. So you know, Viner's being one, but there are other manufacturers are now producing round edge knives where you've got a less lethal sharp point, but you're still able to cut vegetables should you need to do so. And perhaps we should be moving towards that now. I don't believe in knife amnesties, and if we were to say to people, you know, if you hand in your carving knives and your ordinary knives, we'll give you a set of round-edged ones. You know, the wrong target market would be the people that complied. It would be my auntie and my uncle and my mother and such like, rather than the people we want to do it. But I think there is other ways of doing it. We can gradually bring them into a more marketable range. And we could do promotions similar to one that Tesco's did, but giving round-edged knife blocks instead of sharp-edged. And you know, there's a lot to be said for that.
You know, because I know the Glasgow VRU are probably at the forefront of working with people with lived experience, experts by experience. And I know, I think it was Callum that was joined into our conversation on Twitter. Is there an alternative view from any people that you've met, suppose, who having committed knife crime don't disagree with what you and I are discussing now. Have you come across that?
The only people that have ever disagreed with my point of view in this are police officers.
Right.
I'm sympathetic to the view, and what you described at the beginning is the arguments that I regularly get. The reality of the street, making the public aware, showing the public we're doing something, all that is really important. But I keep coming back to this point, and I make it when I'm doing presentations. So the police are not responsible for violence. If you believe in the preventative approach and you believe in the public health approach, and my goodness, there's what 16 VRUs in England now that are giving this message out widespread, then if that message is the right one and it's accepted, then the police aren't responsible for violence. The role of the police is to protect our streets and protect our individuals and to play a part in reducing violence. But actual police activity merely suppresses violence. And if you're going to address violence properly, you have to address the underlying root causes. And that means the responsibility lies with us all. So I don't see that the police are responsible for public reassurance around violence. It's
interesting. So, because we in Lancashire are trying to push that community responsibility, which I think is probably similar to what you're saying there, is that this stuff is commonplace. This conversation should be commonplace in communities. And the other point is that people don't always know is that, and where this figures come from, I don't know, but the suggestion that if you carry a knife, you're more likely to have that taken away from you and used on you. I don't know where I've heard that cited numerous times. Whether there's any empirical evidence for that or not, I don't know. But I don't know if you've heard that.
You need to get some of the academics like Susan McVie and people who have all these figures to hand involved. But we know from numerous studies that we look at victims and repeat victimization but very often the person who's a victim one day can be the offender the next. So you're actually looking at the same set of people. So it's a wider understanding of the problems that we face that's required. And there's a general level of acceptance now. What we need to do is work on public attitude and sometimes work in the attitudes of our own organisations. And this is just typical of where the police don't like getting pushed back. They don't like getting challenged in what they're doing. And this is one occasion where I think a level of pushback is justified. But it's not just the police; it's widespread. Stop using these pictures.
Definitely. I suppose just probably coming towards the end now, but from a victim's family perspective, having unfortunately got to know numerous families over the years who've been bereaved through knife crime, I do hear the argument that frightening young people into not carrying a knife, surely that would be the way to work that through. And when it's the family of someone bereaved, I always find that a difficult conversation to have because they've had that experience. I haven't, but I think overall we're saying you're not going to frighten young people into not carrying. You're just going to make them fearful that everybody else is doing.
So the conversation I mentioned earlier with the press in Dublin came out of such a similar situation. A young man lost his life in a park in Dublin, and his father, very understandably upset, calling for tougher penalties, longer sentences, and some of the members of the Doyle getting behind him with that discussion. It's very difficult when you've got such sympathy for a family in such circumstances, and who wouldn't, to actually give a different message. But that we've been down that road. If tougher sentences were the answer, America would be the safest country in the world. It needs to be far more inventive than that, and it needs to understand the prevailing culture that leads to violence and tackle that. And so the VRU in Scotland, we don't use words like punishment and judgment. We use words like understanding and empathy and love. And I think if we got far more of that collectively, we'd start to make some headway.
Totally agree. I mean, we're going to stray in a minute into, I suppose, the next time we talk is around the VRUs, because I don't know if you know, there's a lot on Twitter last night that Karen McCluskey and I were stopping messages and stuff about, which is this whole concept that poverty, you know, school exclusions, attainment, all those things feature heavily into the reasons why people are so afraid that they, you know, or fearful or just commit violence, because they think that, you know, that's their way of kind of managing their own lives.
And I suspect the catalyst was was Karen's tweet about building more prisons, where you're actually
exactly, yeah,
building more prisons to imprison the next generation of people rather than doing something to stop them in prison in the first instance.
Yeah.
And it has created such a lot of discussion.
Well, the market research I mentioned before, the young people who were surveyed in Lancs said they felt that they were part of the solution, which I whooped and cheered. And then the adults who filled it in said that harsher, longer prison sentences. So it's a narrative that we're used to hearing, but it's great to think that young people see themselves as part of a solution in their own community.
And we have a responsibility to support them in that and not to demonize them. So I think that brings us full circle to start the conversation.
It does.